As the American Civil War raged in 1862, attempting to decide the future of the Union on the battlefield, across the Atlantic, statesmen in London and Paris debated whether to make or break a nation via diplomacy. Since the war scare a year earlier, when a Union ship seized Confederate emissaries, Britain and France had adopted a guarded neutrality. By the summer, however, politicians in both nations were becoming increasingly restless. A mix of the Union blockade and Confederate hopes of applying economic pressure meant that almost no cotton was reaching Europe. One half of Britain's textile workers were unemployed, and a full third of its mills had closed. "We are nearly out of cotton, and cotton we must have," bemoaned the French foreign minister. Adding to the economic concerns about the war, many were genuinely appalled by the scale of the bloodletting in a conflict that seemed to have no end, whilst others were more detached in their simple hopes that a breakup of the Union would weaken the American behemoth. In these circumstances, the failure of McClellan's Peninsula campaign, which reinforced a belief the South could not be conquered, seemed to signal that now was the time for intervention. This would be offered as a form of mediation led by Britain and France, and would inevitably lead to Southern independence if accepted by the Lincoln administration. There was no doubt an approach of this kind had supporters in both London and Paris. The British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, was a keen advocate of the Confederacy, whilst the French Emperor Napoleon was also sympathetic. Offering mediation, however, was a risky venture. If Washington simply refused, the British would have traded an enormous amount of goodwill with the Americans for no gain. They could, in response, attempt to make Southern independence a fait accompli by officially recognising the country, and then sweeping away the Union blockade. But Seward, the Secretary of State, maintained that the conflict was merely an insurrection, and had threatened war in response to any recognition of the Confederacy. These factors all combined then to make a dilemma for British statesmen, who would have to lead any mediation effort. Southern independence would relieve the cotton famine, end the bloodshed, and weaken the United States. But even Palmerston did not think risking a war with the Americans was worth Jefferson Davis's nation. The Confederacy could be besieging Washington and it would still not guarantee recognition, the Prime Minister candidly told one Southern agent. Timing would be everything, offering mediation only when either the Union was too weak to resist British pressure, or the political scene in Washington demonstrated a wish for peace. And, as information filtered through over the following weeks about Second Bull Run and General Lee's invasion of Maryland, that time seemed to have arrived. The Antietam campaign was almost certainly the most dangerous moment in the Civil War for the Union, probably even more so than the Trent affair a year earlier. If Lee had smashed either Pope or McClellan, and the subsequent congressional elections had gone against Lincoln, the British would almost certainly have offered a mediation that Washington would have struggled to refuse. But in absence of this, the British continued to vacillate. For all Palmerston's bluster, he could only rely on support from Gladstone, Russell and Westbury with regards to mediation. Southern agents were extremely canny in tailoring their arguments to each individual minister. The Chancellor was told Richmond planned to make their currency more favourable to the pound, for example, yet there was actually a larger number of Northern sympathisers in the cabinet. It meant, quite apart from the Union's reaction, Palmerston had to tread carefully among his own colleagues until the South won a major victory. Second Bull Run and the Confederate advance into Maryland, though not the decisive smash Palmerston thought was needed, did nonetheless convince him that the time for intervention was approaching. On the 13th of September, Russell, the Foreign Secretary, instructed the ambassador in Paris to sound out his opposite number at the French Foreign Office regarding a joint recommendation of an armistice, followed by a threat that if the Union rejected it, Britain, France, as well as Russia, Austria and Italy might recognise the independence of the Confederacy. But although most agreed it seemed unlikely the North could subdue the South militarily, the cabinet still remained hostile to such a mediation effort when there was no obvious appetite in Washington for it. This was reinforced by the reply from Paris, which was also cold to the proposal. Despite Napoleon's sympathy for the South, He had been convinced by the likes of his foreign minister that mediation could only be successful if a strong peace party emerged in the north. On the 17th of September, the Union won an indecisive victory at Antietam. It was the single bloodiest day in American history, and further convinced Palmerston, along with much of the cabinet, that the South would not be militarily conquered when they received news on the 30th. Talk of mediation now reached its peak. On October the 4th, after hearing from the ambassador that Napoleon suddenly favoured extending recognition to the Confederacy, Russell proposed to Palmerston that Britain immediately adopt a mediation plan on the basis of a separation between North and South. Yet Russell was getting ahead of himself. Antietam had been inconclusive, but what it certainly was not was a major southern battlefield success, which would bring forth a strong peace party in Washington. For much of the cabinet, these remained the prerequisites for any offer of mediation. When Russell presented a detailed memorandum on the 13th of October, only Gladstone supported him. The Colonial Secretary, Newcastle, spoke for many when he argued the proposal was premature. I do not think it can be long before a large party in the North declare itself adverse to the war. Premature intervention by Europe would prevent any such movement and unite the two parties in the same mad resolve to go on. There were other dangerously loose planks in Russell's arguments. He was convinced that all five of the European great powers had to act in concert, even if Britain and France took the lead. But Russian support was in doubt. The Empire had supported Britain the previous year during the Trent debacle, but now seemed, and later confirmed, it was unwilling to jeopardise relations with the Union by threatening to recognise the Confederacy. In the face of this, and Lincoln's determination to prosecute the war, even Palmerston now proposed waiting until the November elections, at which point it was hoped the ever-elusive peace party might emerge. There was an underlying factor to all of this in the issue of slavery. Adams, the American ambassador in London, was aghast at the way Confederate agents and their sympathisers in Britain were able to portray the South as underdogs and victims. Even worse, they had positioned the idea of mediation as a humanitarian duty. Slavery barely seemed to be mentioned. Though there was much sympathy with the more aristocratic way of life in the South, no one of any influence thought slavery a noble cause, least of all Palmerston, probably the most belligerent anti-slavery politician in the mid-19th century. But, with abolition not yet a defined Northern war aim, slavery did not preclude mediation. Indeed, the likes of Russell and Gladstone were of the opinion the best way to bring the institution to an end was for the North and South to separate, though Argyll bluntly told the latter he was deluding himself with such an opinion. Nonetheless, Adams's solution to kill any further vagueness on the topic was to make the conflict about slavery, but Lincoln feared, especially following the failure of the Peninsula Campaign, that emancipation without a victory would be viewed as desperation by foreign observers, our last shriek on the retreat, as Seward put it. Antietam finally changed this. The Union's dubious success was nowhere near as decisive as Lincoln had hoped it would be, and Seward thus remained cautious. Nevertheless, on the 22nd of September, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and all slaves in rebel-held territory declared free. The news was not exactly a thunderbolt to British policy. Opinion still remained convinced the South would not be conquered, and as discussed earlier, it was not the proclamation that stalled Russell's mediation efforts. Nonetheless, for the rest of the war, it hung like an albatross around the Southern cause. Some in Britain naively pressed for the South to abolish slavery themselves in response, an unsurprisingly doomed hope. In that year's elections, the Republicans retained control of Congress, and the Union remained committed to the war. There was to be no British-led armistice. The failure of the mediation movement in the summer and autumn of 1862 was multifaceted. Ultimately, the South's inability to win the decisive victory needed to shake Lincoln's administration meant caution in London and Paris prevailed. New cotton sources were found in Egypt and India. Newspapers could do little but continue to bemoan the bloodshed in the face of Lincoln's resolve, while statesmen still consoled themselves that the South was unconquerable, up until the moment it wasn't. Had, say, Pope's army been completely crushed and the Democrats then won the House, mediation would have been inevitable, but in lieu of that, the chances of ending the Civil War diplomatically always remained slim.